You are standing in the freezing courtyard of a small inn in Germany in the year 1809. Your husband, the man you love most, is less than 3 meters away, checking the harness on the horses under the flickering lantern light. You blink once. When you open your eyes, he is gone. No scream, no footprints, no one saw him leave. A grown man vanished in an instant inside a locked courtyard. This is not fiction. It really happened. And this is only the first of 10 cracks in reality that will make you doubt everything you think you know. Welcome to the series, 10 Cracks in Reality. Lock your doors, because the shadows are watching you. Welcome to the show. Today, we are diving into 10 stories from the early 19th century that will make you question the very fabric of our reality. We have tales of impossible disappearances, scientific horrors, and crimes that seem too strange to be true. If you enjoy stories about the dark and mysterious, please consider hitting that like button. If you click it just right, it might not vanish into thin air like our diplomat here. Seriously, it helps us keep these mysteries alive. Now, lock your doors and stay close. Benjamin had spent the last few hours inside the White Swan trying to eat a warm meal, but his appetite was gone. He sat near the hearth, his heavy traveling cloak still wrapped tightly around his shoulders. Every time the heavy oak door of the inn creaked open to let in a new traveler, Benjamin's hand would instinctively fly to his coat. He was convinced that French spies were closing in on him, and he told Kraus that they couldn't stay the night. They had to keep moving toward the coast. Kraus, the valet, was used to his master's nerves, but this felt different. He watched Benjamin pace the small room, his boots clicking rhythmically on the floorboards. Benjamin wasn't just tired. He was terrified. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones about being followed by shadows. Eventually, the horses were ready. The innkeeper, a man who had seen 1,000 travelers come and go, watched as the two men prepared to leave. It was just after 9 o'clock, and the night was pitch black. The carriage sat in the middle of the courtyard, illuminated by the warm glow of the lanterns hanging by the inn's entrance. Kraus was busy loading their smaller bags into the back, his breath hitching in the freezing air. Benjamin stood by the carriage door, looking at the lead horse. He muttered something about wanting to see if the harness was secure. He walked toward the front of the carriage, his figure silhouetted against the light. Kraus watched him go, expecting him to return in seconds. Benjamin stepped past the heads of the horses, moving into the small patch of darkness just beyond the reach of the lanterns. He was no more than 10 feet away from his valet. There were no alleyways in that part of the courtyard, and the main gate was closed and bolted for the night. The walls of the inn surrounded them like a fortress. Kraus heard the crunch of Benjamin's boots on the frozen gravel. Then the sound stopped. It wasn't a fade, it was a sudden, absolute silence. Kraus waited for a moment, thinking Benjamin had simply stopped to adjust his boots. But when 30 seconds passed without a word, a cold prickle began to crawl up the valet's spine. He called out his master's name, his voice sounding thin and fragile in the quiet night. There was no answer. Kraus walked toward the front of the horses, holding up a small hand lantern. The light cut through the gloom, revealing the empty space where Benjamin should have been standing. The valet's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He looked under the carriage, then behind the large wooden water trough nearby. He ran to the gate and shook the heavy iron bars, but they were still locked tight. There was nowhere for a grown man to go in the 3 seconds he had been out of sight. Kraus ran back into the inn, his face pale and his voice cracking as he screamed for help. Within minutes, the innkeeper and several local soldiers were scouring every inch of the courtyard. They searched the stables, the haylofts, and even the kitchen cellars. They held torches high, looking for any sign of a struggle, but the ground was undisturbed. There were no bloodstains, no torn clothing, and no footprints leading away from the carriage. It was as if Benjamin Bathurst had simply been erased from the world. His wife Phillida, who had been waiting for him to return to England, was eventually notified. She refused to believe he was dead and spent years searching for him. The disappearance sparked an international incident. The British government was convinced that Napoleon's agents had kidnapped him to steal his secret papers. They pressured the French, but even Napoleon himself seemed baffled. He reportedly swore on his honor that he had no knowledge of the diplomat's whereabouts. If the French had taken him, they had done it with a level of stealth that defied any known military tactic. Benjamin had vanished from a locked courtyard while people were watching. Months after the disappearance, two poor women were walking through a forest several miles outside of Perleberg. Near a small clearing, they found a pair of expensive-looking trousers. They were neatly folded as if someone had just stepped out of them and left them behind. When they were brought to the authorities, Kraus identified them immediately. They were the trousers Benjamin had been wearing the night he disappeared. But there were no other clothes, no body, and no signs of violence. The mystery only deepened decades later. In 1852, a house near the White Swan Inn was being renovated. When the workers pulled up the heavy floorboards in the cellar, they found a human skeleton. The skull had been crushed by a heavy blow, leading many to believe that Benjamin had been murdered by someone at the inn and hidden away. However, when the bones were examined, they didn't match Benjamin's height or age. The skeleton belonged to a much older man. To this day, the case of Benjamin Bathurst remains one of the most chilling glitches in history. People have proposed everything from secret tunnels to spontaneous teleportation, but for those who were there that night, the truth was much simpler and much more terrifying. A man walked into a shadow, and the shadow never let him go. He left behind a wife who never stopped looking, and a valet who never looked at a dark corner the same way again. It is a haunting thought that you can be standing right next to someone and still lose them forever in the blink of an eye. We like to think that our world is solid, that the ground beneath our feet is reliable. But Benjamin Bathurst's story suggests that there are cracks in the world, and sometimes people just fall through. It's the kind of fear that makes you want to keep the lights on just to make sure the shadows don't start reaching for you while you aren't looking. But sometimes the things we see in the dark aren't cracks in reality. Sometimes they are much more physical, yet just as terrifying. Only 5 years before Benjamin stepped into the void in Germany, the people of London were dealing with a very different kind of phantom. It was a figure draped in white that haunted the graveyards and alleyways, driving the locals to the brink of madness. And just like Benjamin's disappearance, it would lead to a moment where the line between life and death became dangerously thin. On a freezing, moonless evening in early January of 1804, a 29-year-old man named Francis Smith was walking through the narrow, twisting lanes of Hammersmith. At the time, Hammersmith was a quiet, somewhat isolated village on the outskirts of London. Francis was an excise officer, a job that required responsibility and a steady hand. He was well respected by his neighbors and known for his calm, logical demeanor. In those days, the streets of Hammersmith were a labyrinth of unlit gravel paths and high brick walls. Most of the villagers spent their evenings huddled around their hearths or gathered in the warmth of the Black Lion Inn. Life was predictable and followed the slow rhythm of the seasons. Francis enjoyed this tranquility, finding comfort in the routine of his patrols and the familiar faces of the local tradesmen who populated the village. However, during that winter, the peace of the village began to erode. It started as a whisper in the local pubs, a story passed between nervous travelers. People claimed that a ghost was haunting the churchyard and the dark lanes nearby. This was not just a vague rumor, the descriptions were chillingly specific. They spoke of a tall figure draped entirely in white, appearing out of the darkness and vanishing just as quickly into the thick winter fog. The first real crack in the village's sense of safety happened when a young woman was walking home near the church. Out of the shadows, a pale, towering figure emerged and grabbed her. She didn't stay long enough to see a face, but the sheer terror caused her to collapse in a dead faint. She was found hours later, shivering and hysterical. To the people of 1804, ghosts were not just stories, they were a very real and dangerous threat to the soul. A few days later, another incident pushed the village toward total panic. An elderly man was walking past the graveyard when the white figure suddenly loomed over him. The shock was so profound that the poor man suffered a massive heart attack and died shortly after reaching his home. Suddenly, the Hammersmith ghost wasn't just a nuisance or a prank, it was a killer. The streets that were once filled with evening activity became completely deserted as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Francis Smith watched as his neighbors grew paralyzed by this unseen terror. As a man of the law, he found the situation intolerable. He didn't necessarily believe in the supernatural, but he believed in the physical effect it was having on his community. He decided that if the authorities wouldn't act, he would. He began carrying a loaded shotgun during his nightly walks, determined to confront whatever was hiding in the shadows and put an end to the village's nightmare. On the night of January 3rd, the air was so cold it felt like needles against the skin. Francis stood at the end of Black Lion Lane, a particularly dark and narrow passage that led toward the center of the village. The fog was rolling in off the river, thick and yellow, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He checked the flint on his shotgun, his fingers feeling slightly numb despite his heavy gloves. He was on edge, every snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot in the silence. While Francis was standing guard, a 33-year-old bricklayer named Thomas Millwood was finishing his work for the evening. Thomas was a family man known for being hardworking and reliable. He had a wife and children waiting for him, and he was eager to get home to the warmth of his cottage. He put away his tools and stepped out into the night, unaware that his choice of clothing that evening would become the most significant detail of his entire life. In 1804, bricklayers typically wore very specific work clothes. For Thomas, this meant a pair of linen trousers, a waistcoat, and a long apron, all of which were a brilliant, stark white. In the daylight, he simply looked like a man coming from a job. But in the pitch-black darkness of a Hammersmith winter against the backdrop of a yellow fog, Thomas Millwood didn't look like a man at all. He looked like a glowing, ethereal shape moving through the mist. As Thomas turned into Black Lion Lane, he was walking briskly, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. From the other end of the lane, Francis Smith saw a shape emerge from the fog. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The figure was tall, moving with a strange gliding motion, and it was draped entirely in white. To Francis, there was no doubt. This was the monster that had killed his neighbor. Francis raised his shotgun to his shoulder, his breathing coming in sharp, shallow bursts. He called out into the darkness, his voice trembling slightly. "Who are you? Stand and deliver, or I shall fire." The figure did not stop. It didn't speak. It simply continued to move toward him through the haze. Francis waited 3 seconds, his mind racing through every story of terror he had heard in the pub. He called out one more time, but the white shape kept coming. In a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, Francis pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun blast shattered the silence of the village, and a bright flash of orange light momentarily blinded him. When the smoke cleared and his vision returned, the white figure was gone from his sight. It had collapsed into a heap on the frozen ground. Francis stepped forward, his legs feeling heavy and weak, expecting to find a tattered shroud or a pile of mist. Instead, as he lowered his lantern, the light revealed the horrifying truth. Lying in the dirt was Thomas Millwood. The white linen of his waistcoat was rapidly turning a dark, visceral crimson. He had been shot directly in the jaw, and it was clear he had died instantly. There was no ghost. There was only a man who had been walking home to his wife wearing the clothes of his trade. Francis fell to his knees, the realization of what he had done hitting him like a physical blow. The sound of the shot brought the villagers running from their homes. Among them was Thomas's sister, who had warned him only a few days prior that his white clothes might get him into trouble given the current state of the village. The scene was one of absolute chaos and grief. Francis didn't try to run. He handed his gun to the local watchman, his face a mask of pale shock, and allowed himself to be led away. He was a man of the law who had become a murderer. As the investigation unfolded, a strange detail came to light. There actually was a ghost, but it wasn't Thomas. A local shoemaker named John Graham had been dressing up in a white sheet to scare his apprentices who had been telling ghost stories to his children. He had intended it as a harmless prank, never imagining that his games would lead to a real-life execution. John Graham walked free while Francis Smith was sent to the Old Bailey to stand trial for his life. The trial of Francis Smith became one of the most famous legal battles in British history. The jury was torn. They felt immense sympathy for Francis, believing that he had acted without malice and out of a genuine, if mistaken, fear for the safety of his village. They initially tried to return a verdict of manslaughter, which would have saved him from the gallows. However, the judges were stern. They insisted that a mistaken belief did not give a man the right to kill. The judges argued that if they allowed thinking someone was a ghost as a defense for murder, then anyone could kill anyone and simply claim they were scared of spirits. After a long and agonizing deliberation, the jury was forced to change their verdict. Francis Smith was found guilty of willful murder and sentenced to be hanged, and then dissected the most shameful end possible for a gentleman of that era. The courtroom fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The case was so controversial that it eventually reached the king himself. Due to the unique circumstances and the lack of any prior criminal record, Francis's sentence was commuted to 1 year of hard labor, and he was eventually pardoned. But the legal question he raised, the Hammersmith ghost case, remained a cornerstone of English law for nearly 2 centuries. It forced the world to decide where the line sits between a reasonable fear and a criminal act. Francis Smith lived out the rest of his days as a quiet, broken man. He never forgot the image of that white figure in the fog, or the way the color changed when the lantern hit the ground. The village of Hammersmith eventually returned to normal, but for decades, parents would tell their children to never wear white after dark. They knew that sometimes the things that look like spirits are just men, and the things that look like heroes are just terrified neighbors. Thomas Millwood was buried in the very churchyard where the ghost was said to have first appeared. His headstone became a local landmark, a reminder of a night when superstition and modern law collided in the dark. The ghost was gone, but the memory of the bricklayer in white remained a lingering afterimage in the minds of everyone who walked Black Lion Lane. It was a tragedy born from a shadow, a life ended because of a color and a moment of panic. The death of Thomas Millwood proved that a single witness's perspective can be dangerously flawed, especially when fear is driving the narrative. But in the world of crime and mystery, witnesses come in many forms, and they aren't always human. While the people of London were debating the nature of ghosts and legal intent, a group of sailors in the Caribbean was about to find the most undeniable proof of a crime in the belly of a deep-sea predator. At 10 o'clock on a scorching morning in late August of 1799, the merchant brig Nancy was cutting through the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. The sun was a punishing, white-hot disk in the sky, reflecting off the salt-crusted deck with a blinding intensity. Captain Thomas Briggs stood by the railing, his hand shielding his eyes as he scanned the horizon for any sign of a sail. To any outsider, it was a peaceful morning of trade. Thomas was a man who took great pride in his ship and his reputation as a merchant from Baltimore. The Nancy was a fast, nimble vessel laden with barrels of flour and dry goods intended for the islands. On the surface, Thomas looked like any other hardworking sailor trying to make a living in a dangerous time. But beneath that calm exterior, his heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he thought about the hidden compartments in the hull. The Caribbean in the late 18th century was a chessboard of war and shifting loyalties. The British Royal Navy was the ultimate predator in these waters, constantly hunting for ships that were trading with their enemies, the French and the Dutch. Thomas knew that if he were caught with the wrong documents, his ship would be seized and he would be ruined. He had spent years building this life, and he wasn't about to let it be taken away by a British officer. By midday, the wind shifted slightly, bringing with it the smell of salt and old wood. Thomas felt the ship heel over as it caught the breeze, and for a moment he allowed himself to relax. He checked the compass and adjusted his hat, feeling confident that they would reach their destination without incident. He had navigated these waters dozens of times, and he knew every hidden cove and current. To Thomas, the ocean was a familiar friend that usually kept its secrets. However, just as he was about to head below deck for a meal, a shout from the lookout shattered the silence. High up in the rigging, a sailor was pointing toward the southwest. Thomas grabbed his brass spyglass and extended it, his hands slightly damp with sweat. In the distance, a small white speck was growing larger against the deep blue of the sea. It was a British cruiser, and it was moving with a speed that suggested it had already spotted the Nancy. The cruiser was the HMS Sparrow, commanded by Lieutenant Hugh Wiley. Wiley was a man known for his sharp instincts and his relentless pursuit of smugglers. He had been watching the Nancy for hours, tracking its movements and noting how low it sat in the water. As the Sparrow closed the gap, Thomas felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He knew that a standard inspection was coming, and he knew that his current papers wouldn't stand up to a truly thorough search. Thomas ordered his crew to crowd on more sail, but the Nancy was a merchant vessel, not a warship. The gap between the two ships continued to shrink until the roar of a warning shot from the Sparrow's bow chaser echoed across the waves. The ball of iron skipped across the water, sending up a fountain of spray just a few yards from the Nancy's hull. Thomas had no choice. He ordered his men to heave to and wait for the boarding party to arrive. As the British sailors rowed toward them in a small boat, Thomas turned to his first mate with a look of pure desperation. He reached into a hidden pocket in his coat and pulled out a small weighted leather pouch. Inside were the true logs of the Nancy written in Dutch, which proved he was trading with the enemy. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the stern of the ship, checked to make sure no one was looking, and dropped the pouch into the deep, dark water. He watched for a second as the pouch sank, a tiny, dark shape disappearing into the blue abyss. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. Without those papers, the British had nothing but suspicion. He quickly pulled out a set of forged American documents from another pocket and smoothed them out. By the time Lieutenant Wiley climbed over the railing and onto the deck of the Nancy Thomas, was standing there with a polite, if somewhat annoyed expression on his face. Wiley was a man who didn't care for pleasantries. He immediately began questioning Thomas about his cargo, his destination, and his origins. Thomas answered every question with the practiced ease of a man who had told the same lie 100 times. He showed Wiley the forged papers, which seemed to be in perfect order. Wiley's men spent hours tearing through the cargo, opening barrels of flour, and checking the bilge, but they found absolutely nothing illegal. Despite the lack of evidence, Wiley's gut told him that something was wrong. He didn't like the way Thomas's eyes darted toward the stern of the ship, or the way the crew seemed too rehearsed in their movements. He decided to exercise his authority as a naval officer during wartime. He informed Thomas that the Nancy was being detained and escorted to Port Royal, Jamaica, where a vice admiralty court would determine if the ship and its cargo were a legal prize of war. Port Royal was often called the wickedest city on earth, a place of heat, rum, and high-stakes legal battles. When the Nancy arrived, Thomas was placed under a loose form of house arrest while the court proceedings began. He spent his days in the humid courtrooms, listening to lawyers argue over maritime law. He remained confident. He knew that the ocean was miles deep where he had dropped his papers. The evidence was gone, eaten by the tides and the darkness. In the courtroom, Thomas put on a masterful performance. He portrayed himself as a victim of British overreach, a simple American merchant whose rights were being trampled. The judge seemed to be leaning in his favor, as Lieutenant Wiley had nothing to present but his own suspicions. Without the physical proof of the Dutch papers, the law was on Thomas's side. It looked like the Nancy would be released, and Thomas would even be able to sue for damages. But while Thomas was celebrating his impending victory in the taverns of Port Royal, something extraordinary was happening miles away in the waters off the coast of Haiti. Another British ship, the HMS Abergavenny, was anchored in a quiet bay. The crew was bored and the heat was stifling, so a group of sailors decided to go fishing. They were hoping to catch something for dinner to break the monotony of salt, pork, and hardtack that made up their usual diet. As they sat on the deck, one of the men noticed a massive shape moving slowly through the clear water near the ship's hull. It was a shark, a monster of a creature well over 10 feet long. It had been following the ship for days, scavenging whatever scraps the cook threw overboard. The sailors, seeing an opportunity for a bit of excitement, baited a massive iron hook with a piece of spoiled beef and tossed it into the water with a heavy splash. The shark didn't hesitate. It lunged at the bait, its rows of jagged teeth snapping shut on the hook. For nearly an hour, the sailors struggled with the beast, their muscles straining against the thick rope as the shark thrashed and rolled, turning the water into a white foam. Eventually, they managed to haul the exhausted predator onto the deck. It lay there, its gills heaving and its cold black eyes staring at the men who had bested it in its own domain. In those days, sailors were superstitious and curious. They believed that sharks often swallowed strange things, and they wanted to see what was inside this one. A boatswain's mate took a sharp knife and began to gut the creature. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting fish and copper-scented blood. As he reached into the shark's stomach, his hand brushed against something hard and flat that felt out of place among the usual bones and debris. He pulled out a bundle of papers tied tightly with a piece of waxed string. The external layer was wet and stained with digestive juices, but the bundle itself was remarkably intact. The lack of oxygen inside the shark's stomach had prevented the paper from rotting. The sailor wiped away the grime and realized he was looking at a set of official ship's logs. He didn't know much about the law, but he knew that finding papers inside a shark was something his captain should see. The papers were delivered to the captain of the Abergavenny, who immediately recognized their importance. They were the very documents that Thomas Briggs had dropped overboard days earlier. By a 1 in a million chance, the shark had swallowed the pouch before it could sink into the silt of the ocean floor. The captain ordered a fast boat to take the documents to Port Royal, where the trial of the Nancy was reaching its final critical stages. Back in the courtroom, Thomas was standing before the judge, waiting for the final verdict that would set him free. He looked around the room with a smug grin, feeling like the smartest man in the Caribbean. Just as the judge was about to speak, the heavy doors at the back of the room swung open. A British officer marched down the center aisle, holding a tattered, foul-smelling bundle of papers. He handed them to the prosecutor, who looked at them with growing shock. The prosecutor stood up and requested a brief recess to examine the new evidence. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It went from a quiet legal proceeding to a scene of absolute tension. The prosecutor walked toward Thomas, holding the papers. He asked Thomas if he recognized them. Thomas looked at the stains, the handwriting, and the weighted leather pouch. His face turned a sickly shade of gray, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The papers were read aloud to the court. They were the original logs of the Nancy, written in Dutch, detailing every illegal transaction and every hidden port Thomas had visited. The evidence was undeniable. It was a voice from the grave delivered by a creature of the deep. Thomas couldn't even offer a defense. He sat in his chair, his head in his hands, as the judge delivered a new verdict. The Nancy and its cargo were condemned as a legal prize. The story of the shark papers became a legend almost overnight. It was a reminder that the ocean is not a place where things are simply lost. It is a witness that can testify against you when you least expect it. Thomas Briggs lost everything, his ship, his wealth, and his reputation. He left Port Royal a broken man, haunted by the thought that a single shark swimming in a vast ocean had managed to find the one piece of evidence he thought was gone forever. For years afterward, the actual jaws of the shark that caught Thomas were displayed in the Admiralty office in Jamaica, with the papers tucked inside as a warning to other smugglers. It served as a grim testament to the fact that even in the lawless reaches of the sea, justice has a way of surfacing. To this day, the original shark papers are kept in the Institute of Jamaica, their ink still legible despite the time they spent in the belly of a predator. Thomas had tried to bury his secrets in the depths of the Caribbean, believing that the silence of the water would protect him. But the natural world has its own set of rules, and sometimes those rules collide with human ambition in ways that feel like fate. It was a literal gut feeling that brought him down, proving that the most dangerous witness isn't always the one standing in the box. Sometimes the witness is waiting beneath the waves, teeth bared in the dark. While the story of Thomas Briggs shows how a creature of the wild can bring a man to justice, our next story explores a much more unsettling intersection of nature and human intent. It takes us away from the sunny, blood-stained decks of the Caribbean and into a cold, clinical room in the heart of London. Here, the predator wasn't a shark, but a man of science, who believed he could use the power of the lightning to do the one thing the ocean cannot bring the dead back to life. On a biting gray Monday morning in January of 1803, a massive crowd began to gather outside the grim stone walls of Newgate Prison in London. The air was so cold that every breath hung like a ghost in the narrow streets, and the mud underfoot had frozen into sharp, jagged ridges. Most of the people there were looking for a distraction from their own desperate lives, drawn by the dark promise of a public execution that felt more like a ritual than justice. At the center of this chaos was a man named George Forster. Only a few months prior, George had been an ordinary, unremarkable figure navigating the crowded docks and foggy alleys of the city. He was a man who lived in the shadows of the Industrial Revolution, trying to find his footing in a world that felt increasingly mechanical and cold. To his neighbors, he seemed like any other laborer struggling to keep his head above the rising tide of poverty that was drowning the city. However, the image of George as a simple worker had been shattered by a discovery in the Paddington Canal. The bodies of his wife and their young daughter had been found floating in the dark, stagnant water, and all evidence pointed back to George. The trial had been swift, and the public sentiment was vicious. In the eyes of Londoners, George Forster was not just a murderer, he was a traitor to the very idea of family, and they wanted to see him pay the ultimate price on the gallows. The crowd's roar died down as the heavy wooden door of the prison finally creaked open. Two guards emerged, followed by a priest who was whispering low, urgent prayers that were lost to the wind. Between them walked George Forster. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, and his face was a mask of hollow gray terror. He looked less like a monster and more like a man who had already left his soul somewhere deep within the dark, windowless cells of Newgate Prison. As George was led up the wooden steps of the gallows, his knees buckled, and for a moment it seemed like he would collapse before the noose could be fitted around his neck. The executioner worked with a practiced cold efficiency, adjusting the heavy hemp rope and pulling the black hood over George's head. The silence that fell over the thousands of spectators was absolute, broken only by the distant tolling of a church bell and the soft whistling of the wind through the rafters. With the pull of a lever, the trapdoor swung open. George Forster fell into the dark void, his life ending in a violent, sudden snap. The crowd watched the body sway in the wind for nearly an hour, a grim pendulum marking the passage of time in a city that seemed to thrive on such spectacles. To the onlookers, this was the end of the story, the closing of a dark chapter. But for George Forster, the most terrifying part of his journey was only just beginning to unfold. According to the laws of the time, the bodies of executed murderers were often handed over to the Royal College of Surgeons for dissection. This was seen as a final post-mortem punishment, a way to ensure that the criminal found no rest even in the grave. As George's body was cut down and placed in a wooden cart, a man named Giovanni Aldini stepped out of the shadows. He was a scientist, a man of intense curiosity, and he had a very specific plan for the remains. Giovanni Aldini was the nephew of Luigi Galvani, the man who had discovered that the muscles of dead frogs would twitch when touched by an electric spark. Aldini had taken his uncle's research and pushed it to its most extreme and controversial limit. He wasn't interested in frogs or small animals anymore. He believed that electricity was the literal vital spark of life itself, and he had been waiting for a fresh human subject to prove his theories to the scientific world. George Forster's body was still warm when it arrived at the demonstration theater. The room was packed with elite scientists, doctors, and a few high-ranking city officials who had heard rumors of what was about to take place. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of old parchment formaldehyde and the ozone-like scent of the massive voltaic piles, early batteries, that Aldini had arranged around a central marble table where George now lay perfectly still. Aldini stood over the body, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. He explained to the hushed audience that he was going to apply a powerful electrical current to the nerves of the deceased. He spoke of the possibility of reanimating the dead, of bridging the gap between this world and whatever lies beyond. To the men in the room, it felt like they were standing on the threshold of a new era, one where the boundaries of life and death were about to be rewritten by science. The scientist picked up two copper wires, which were connected to a massive battery consisting of layers of zinc and silver discs. He approached George's head and carefully touched the first wire to his mouth and the second to his ear. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The room was so quiet you could hear the flickering of the candle flames. Then a sudden, violent spasm rippled through the dead man's face. The audience gasped, several men leaning back in their chairs. George's jaw began to quiver as if he were trying to speak from across the void. His facial muscles contorted into a series of grotesque expressions. First a look of intense pain, then a sudden chilling sneer. But the most horrifying moment came when the current hit a specific nerve. George's left eye snapped open and stared directly at the ceiling. It wasn't the dull, clouded look of a corpse. For a split second, it looked like there was a conscious intelligence behind the iris. Aldini was encouraged by the reaction and moved the wires to different parts of the body. When he touched the wires to the nerves in the neck, the dead man's head began to roll from side to side as if he were waking from a long, troubled sleep. The spectators watched in a mixture of awe and absolute revulsion. They were witnessing a man who had been dead for hours, performing the motions of the living, all controlled by the invisible power of the lightning in the wires. The experiment escalated as Aldini applied the current to the chest and arms. Suddenly, George's right hand flew up his fingers, clenching into a tight, powerful fist. He pounded the marble table with a force that echoed through the stone hall. To those watching, it didn't look like a muscle reflex anymore. It looked like George Forster was fighting his way back into the room, reaching out from the darkness to grab onto the living world that had so recently discarded him. As the current continued to flow, the dead man's legs began to kick, and his chest heaved in a perfect mimicry of breathing. One of the spectators, a prison official named Mr. Pass, who had been present for the execution, watched the scene with a growing sense of dread. He had seen George die. He had seen the light leave his eyes on the gallows. Seeing the body move with such violent, unnatural vigor was more than his mind or his heart could handle in that moment. Mr. Pass began to hyperventilate his face, turning a deep, sickly purple. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that surpassed any fear of the living. Before anyone could reach him, he collapsed to the floor, his heart giving out from the sheer psychological shock of the demonstration. He died right there in the theater, just a few feet away from the corpse that was still twitching and dancing under the influence of the copper wires and the massive batteries. The death of the official cast a dark shadow over the proceedings. The room, which had been filled with scientific curiosity, was now thick with an atmosphere of supernatural dread. Aldini, sensing the shift in the crowd, finally disconnected the wires. George Forster's body immediately went limp, returning to the cold, motionless state of death. The eye remained open, however, staring blankly into the distance as if it had seen something in the beyond that it couldn't forget. In the days that followed, news of the experiment spread through London like a wildfire. People were horrified by the idea that science could disturb the eternal rest of the soul. The press called it a resurrection, and religious leaders condemned Aldini as a man playing God. The scientist eventually had to flee the city, his reputation tarnished by the death of the official and the visceral reaction of the public. He had proven his point, but the cost had been far too high. Despite the controversy, the memory of George Forster's reanimated hand and staring eye lingered in the collective consciousness of the era. A few years later, a young woman named Mary Shelley heard the story of the galvanized corpse while traveling through Europe. The image of a dead man being brought back to life by a spark of electricity stayed with her, eventually serving as the core inspiration for her most famous work, the classic Gothic horror novel Frankenstein. George Forster had been a man who sought to disappear into the mundane life of the city, but his crimes and his final performance ensured that his name would be remembered for centuries. He became the literal template for the modern monster, a reminder that the line between life and death is a fragile thing that can be manipulated by those with enough curiosity and power. His body was eventually buried in an unmarked grave, but the echoes of his awakening never truly died. For the people who were in that room in 1803, the world never felt quite the same. They had seen that a body could be forced to move without a soul, and that the vital spark could be manufactured in a lab. It was a nightmare birthed from progress, a haunting image of a man reaching out from the grave to strike the table of his own dissection. It was science at its most terrifying, revealing that sometimes the dead have a way of coming back. Forster's body eventually went still, but the image of a murderer waking up on the slab haunted London for an entire generation. It was a nightmare, birthed from a blend of curiosity and cold steel. But while the people of England were terrified of a single man returning from the grave in a laboratory thousands of miles away, the crew of a ship called the Boyd was about to discover that the living can be far more terrifying than the dead, especially when they are driven by a hunger that knows no end. In December of 1809, a large sailing ship named the Boyd sat anchored in the deep emerald waters of Whangaroa Harbor off the coast of New Zealand. The vessel was a beautiful sight with its towering masts and miles of rigging silhouetted against the lush green mountains that rose straight out of the sea. For the crew, this was supposed to be a brief, profitable stop. They had spent months at sea traveling from Sydney with a cargo of timber and coal, and now they were here to harvest the massive kauri trees that grew in thick forests right up to the water's edge. These trees were legendary for their height and strength, making them perfect for ship masts. To the 70-odd people on board the harbor, felt like a tropical paradise, a quiet refuge from the open ocean. Among the crew was a young man named Thomas, a sailor who had spent most of his life navigating the rough waters of the Atlantic before joining this voyage. He was used to the hardships of the sea, but something about this specific harbor felt different. It was too quiet. The wind didn't whistle through the trees like it did in other places, and the birds watched with a strange, silent intensity. But Thomas pushed those thoughts aside. The captain of the Boyd was a man named John Thompson, a stern and often temperamental leader who didn't tolerate any talk of bad omens or uneasy feelings. Thompson was focused entirely on his cargo and his schedule. He wanted those kauri trees cut loaded and ready for the long journey back to England as quickly as possible, and he didn't care who he stepped on to get it done. To help navigate the local customs, the ship was carrying several Maori passengers who were returning to their homes in New Zealand. One of them was a young man the crew called George. In his own culture, he was known as Tara, and he was actually the son of a powerful local chief. He was a proud, intelligent young man who had spent time in Australia to learn the ways of the Europeans, hoping to bridge the gap between his people and the visitors. However, Captain Thompson didn't see a chief's son when he looked at George. He saw a common laborer who owed him work in exchange for his passage. One morning, early in the voyage, a minor dispute broke out on the deck. Thompson accused George of stealing some small items from the galley. George denied it, his voice steady and respectful, explaining that as a high-ranking member of his tribe, he would never stoop to such a petty crime. The captain didn't want to hear explanations. He saw George's calm demeanor as a sign of defiance. In front of the entire crew, including Thomas the captain, ordered George to be tied to a mast and whipped. It was a brutal, humiliating punishment, especially for a man of George's status. Thomas watched from the shadows of the rigging as the lash fell. He saw the skin on the young man's back tear and the silent, burning anger in his eyes. George didn't scream. He didn't plead for mercy. He just stared straight ahead, his fingers digging into the wood of the mast until his knuckles turned white. When it was over, Thompson laughed and told him to get back to work. For the rest of the voyage, George remained silent, performing his duties without a word of complaint. But Thomas noticed that the young man often looked toward the horizon, his hand resting on the scars that now marked his skin as a permanent map of his shame. When the Boyd finally dropped anchor in Whangaroa, the tension seemed to vanish. George's tribe came out in their canoes to greet the ship, and George appeared to be overjoyed to see his family again. He went ashore with them, and a few hours later, he returned to the ship with a wide smile and an invitation. He told Captain Thompson that his father, the chief, wanted to show them the best Corey trees located just a short distance into the forest. Thompson, blinded by his own arrogance and greed, saw this as a perfect opportunity to fill his ship and leave. He believed that George had been broken by the whipping and was now eager to please him. He ordered a landing party to be formed, selecting several of his best men, including Thomas, to go ashore and begin the work. They loaded the longboats with saws, axes, and muskets, rowing toward a small, secluded beach where the Maori were waiting with open arms. The air on the beach was heavy and humid, the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation thick in the lungs. George was there, dressed in his traditional Maori cloak, greeting the sailors like they were old friends. He led the way, stepping onto a narrow trail that disappeared into the dense undergrowth. The forest was so thick that the sunlight only reached the ground in small dappled patches, and the sound of the ocean was quickly replaced by the hum of insects. As they walked deeper into the woods, Thomas noticed that George was moving with a new kind of confidence. He wasn't the subservient laborer from the ship anymore. He moved through the brush with a fluid, predatory grace. Every few minutes, George would stop and point out a particularly large tree. He encouraged the captain to move further and further away from the safety of the beach. Thomas felt a familiar knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He looked back toward the path, but the brush was so thick he could no longer see the water. The sailors were spread out in a long line, their heavy boots crunching loudly on the dry leaves. The Maori guides were moving silently on either side of them, their faces hidden by the shadows of the ferns. Suddenly, George stopped at the base of a massive kauri tree and turned to face Captain Thompson. The smile was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow expression. Before Thompson could speak, George reached out and touched the scars on his own back. He whispered a single word in his native language, and the forest erupted into chaos. From behind the trees and out of the thick ferns, dozens of Maori warriors lunged forward. They weren't carrying saws or axes, they were wielding heavy stone clubs and sharpened spears. The attack was so sudden and so violent that the sailors didn't even have time to raise their muskets or cry out for help. Thomas saw the captain fall first, his head crushed by a single blow from a club. He tried to turn and run, but the brush caught at his clothes, dragging him back toward the carnage. He fell to his knees, his hands scrambling in the dirt as he heard the screams of his shipmates. The air was suddenly filled with the iron scent of blood and the sound of heavy thuds as the warriors worked with a terrifying, efficient speed. Within minutes, the entire landing party was gone. But the horror was only beginning for those left behind on the wooden sanctuary of the ship. On the ship, the remaining crew and passengers were leaning over the railing, watching the tree line and waiting for their friends to return. They had heard the distant shouts, but they assumed it was just the excitement of finding the timber. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the water, they saw the longboats emerge from the small beach and begin to row back toward the Boyd. From the deck, it looked like the sailors were returning. They were wearing the same blue jackets and hats that the landing party had taken ashore. The people on the Boyd began to cheer, waving their caps in the air as the boats cut through the calm water. But as the boats got closer, the cheering died down. Something was wrong. The men in the boats weren't rowing with the rhythmic practice stroke of the sailors. They were moving with a strange, jerky motion, their faces hidden by the low light of the sunset. By the time the crew realized the truth, it was too late. The men in the boats weren't their shipmates. They were Maori warriors who had stripped the clothing from the dead sailors to get close. They swarmed up the sides of the Boyd like a rising tide, their clubs swinging, before they even reached the deck. The screams that echoed across the harbor that night were loud enough to be heard for miles, a discordant symphony of terror and metal. In the chaos, 4 people managed to scramble up into the high rigging, clinging to the topmasts as the slaughter unfolded below them. They watched in absolute silence as their world was torn apart. They saw the fires being lit on the shore and heard the rhythmic chanting of the warriors rising from the beach. The smell of smoke and roasting meat began to drift across the water, a scent so visceral and wrong that it made their stomachs turn with a sickening liquid dread. For 3 long days, the survivors sat in the rigging, their hands raw and bleeding from the ropes, watching as the Maori dismantled their ship. They saw them carry away the barrels of flour, the rolls of silk, and the heavy crates of tools. But most terrifying of all was seeing the way the warriors treated their fallen crew. This wasn't just a battle, it was a ritual of Utu, the balancing of a debt. The Maori believed that every action must have an equal reaction, and by whipping a chief's son, Captain Thompson had insulted the entire tribe. To restore their honor, they didn't just need to kill him, they had to consume his strength and erase his presence. The survivors watched from their high perch as the warriors held a feast on the beach, using the very fire from the ship's timber to cook the remains of the crew. It was a level of horror that the human mind isn't built to process a primal nightmare that defied the civilized world they came from. On the third day, the warriors finally set fire to the Boyd itself. The flames climbed the masts, licking at the feet of the 4 survivors until they were forced to jump into the water to escape the heat. By some miracle, the Maori decided to spare them a woman, 2 small children, and a cabin boy who had been kind to George during the voyage. They were taken to the shore, where they were forced to live as captives, watching the smoke of their ship drift away into the sky. They were now ghosts in a land that had utterly rejected their presence. Eventually, a passing ship heard the rumors of the massacre and came to investigate the quiet harbor. They found the blackened hull of the Boyd sitting in the shallow water, a tomb for 66 people. The survivors were rescued, but they were never the same. They spent the rest of their lives trying to explain how a single arrogant act of cruelty could lead to the complete destruction of an entire ship and every soul on board. It was a debt that could never truly be settled. The Boyd Massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of New Zealand. The tragedy serves as a grim reminder that respect is the only shield that truly works in a strange land. The kauri trees still grow in the mountains of Whangaroa, their massive trunks reaching toward the clouds, but the harbor is no longer a paradise. It is a place where the shadows seem a little deeper, and the silence of the forest feels like it's waiting for another debt to be collected from the unwary. The cabin boy Thomas Davis survived to tell his story to the world, his voice trembling every time he spoke of the blue jackets the warriors wore as they rode. He never forgot the image of the fire reflecting in the dark water, or the way the forest seemed to swallow his friends without leaving a trace. It was a tragedy born from a lash a life ended because of a single cold-hearted choice made by a man who thought he was untouchable. While the crew of the Boyd faced a nightmare in the wild forests of New Zealand, another kind of horror was unfolding in the civilized streets of Yorkshire. There, the danger wasn't coming from a tribe seeking justice, but from a woman who claimed to hold the secrets of the spirit world. She didn't use stone clubs or spears to take what she wanted. She used the quiet power of a lie and a handful of poison to slowly weave a web of death that was just as absolute and just as terrifying. This woman, known as the Yorkshire Witch, understood that the mind can be a much more effective weapon than the blade. As she sat in her quiet cottage preparing her deadly mixtures, she was about to show the world that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who invites you in for a cup of tea and a slice of bread. In the humid, coal-stained summer of 1806, within the sprawling industrial landscape of Leeds, England, a 40-year-old cloth dresser named William Perigot was living a life defined by simple, honest labor. William was a man of predictable patterns, spending his long days navigating the deafening roar of the textile mills and his quiet evenings in a modest cottage with his wife, Rebecca. They were a couple who had built their small world on a foundation of hard work and mutual devotion, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful future. However, beneath the surface of their ordinary routine, a subtle but persistent sense of dread had begun to take hold of their household. For several months, Rebecca had been experiencing strange, fluttering sensations in her chest and a chilling anxiety that seemed to seep into her bones whenever she was alone. She became convinced that their home was the target of a supernatural curse, perhaps cast by a jealous acquaintance. Every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the hearth fire felt like a dark omen of something waiting in the shadows. It was during this period of escalating fear that a neighbor mentioned a woman named Mary Bateman. Mary didn't live in a secluded forest or a crumbling tower. She occupied a small, well-kept house on Black Dog Yard, right in the heart of the city's bustling district. She was known to the local community as a wise woman, a person who claimed to possess the ability to communicate with spirits and provide protection to those targeted by unseen malice. To William and Rebecca, she sounded like a beacon of hope in a world that had suddenly turned cold and hostile. When the couple first crossed the threshold of Mary's cottage, they didn't encounter a terrifying figure of legend. Instead, they were greeted by a maternal, soft-spoken woman in her late 30s who seemed deeply moved by their story. Mary sat in a high-backed wooden chair, listening with intense focus as Rebecca described her symptoms and her fears. She spoke in a calm, soothing tone, telling them that they were indeed victims of a powerful curse, but she also introduced them to a mysterious spirit guide she called Mrs. Moore. The first indication that their lives were shifting into a truly bizarre territory occurred just a week later. Mary invited the Paragos to her home to witness what she described as a divine miracle. She led them into her cramped kitchen where a brown hen was nesting in a pile of straw. As they watched, the bird stood up and Mary reached into the nest to retrieve a freshly laid egg. But this was no ordinary egg. Etched clearly onto the pale shell as if carved by an invisible hand were the haunting words, "Time is come." To a modern observer, the trickery might seem obvious, but for William and Rebecca, it was a staggering, life-altering revelation. They were simple people living in an era where the boundary between religious faith and ancient folklore was incredibly porous. Seeing those words on the egg felt like receiving a direct message from the heavens. They felt a profound sense of awe mixed with a new, sharper kind of terror. If the spirits were reaching out through such mundane means, then the danger they were in must be far more absolute. Mary explained that Mrs. Moore required specific offerings to maintain the protective shield around their home. At first, the demands were relatively small, a few yards of expensive flannel or a silver coin to be blessed. But as the months passed, the instructions became increasingly complex and costly. Mary told them they needed to provide 4 large banknotes each to be wrapped in a specific piece of silk and sewn into their bedding. She issued a stern warning. If they ever looked inside the silk, the magic would vanish. William felt a persistent cold knot of unease tightening in his stomach every time he handed over their savings. He was a man who understood the value of a shilling, and seeing their future disappear into Mary's apron was a heavy burden. But every time he considered stopping the payments, Rebecca's health would take a terrifying turn for the worse. She would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart drumming against her ribs, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps, convinced that a dark figure was watching her. By the spring of 1808, the Paragos were standing on the brink of total financial ruin. They had given Mary over £70, a massive sum for a working-class family, along with their most valuable clothing and furniture. It was then that Mary's demeanor began to change. The maternal warmth was replaced by a sense of urgent, flickering anxiety. She told William that the spirits were demanding a final, decisive act. The holy work was reaching its climax, and they were required to perform a week-long ritual. Mary arrived at their cottage one evening carrying a small, heavy stone jar. Inside was a thick, sweet-smelling substance she referred to as holy pudding. She instructed William and Rebecca that for the next 6 days they were to consume nothing but this pudding and a specific loaf of bread she had prepared for them. She emphasized with a cold intensity that they must not allow anyone else to taste the food and they must remain strictly confined to their house. The ritual was designed to finally burn the curse out of their blood. On the first morning of the ritual, William took a small, tentative bite of the pudding. It had a strange, cloying sweetness followed by a harsh, metallic aftertaste that made the back of his throat feel dry and raw. Within an hour, his stomach began to churn with a violent, liquid heat that he had never felt before. He looked over at Rebecca, who had eaten a much larger portion in her desperation to be healed. She was slumped against the kitchen table, her face a sickly, translucent shade of gray, her fingers twitching. As the afternoon wore on, the promised purification transformed into a visceral, living nightmare. Rebecca began to vomit with a violence that left her gasping and shivering on the floor. William tried to move toward her, but his own legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if his muscles had been replaced by lead. A cold, oily sweat poured down his neck, and his vision began to blur at the edges. He wanted to scream for the neighbors, but he was paralyzed by the memory of Mary's warning that any interference would result in their destruction. By the third day of the confinement, the atmosphere inside the cottage was thick with the scent of sickness and unwashed bodies. Rebecca's condition had deteriorated into a state of semi-consciousness. She could no longer speak, her voice reduced to a series of low, rhythmic moans that filled the quiet rooms. Her skin was freezing to the touch, yet she thrashed about as if she were being consumed by an invisible fire. William, who had only eaten a fraction of the pudding, watched her from the shadows, his mind spinning. On the fourth night, the heavy silence of the bedroom was shattered by a sudden sharp intake of air. Rebecca's entire body stiffened, her spine arching off the bed as her eyes snapped open, staring into the darkness with a look of pure, concentrated terror. For a single heartbeat, she seemed to be looking at something William couldn't see. Then she collapsed back onto the pillows, her breath leaving her in one long final sigh. William reached out to touch her hand, but he found no warmth, no pulse, only the silence of the grave. Broken and still suffering from a burning pain in his gut, William waited until the designated 6 days had passed before he dared to defy Mary's instructions. With shaking hands and a heart heavy with dread, he took a pair of scissors and slid open the silk packets that were supposed to contain their life savings. As the fabric parted, his breath caught in his throat. There were no banknotes inside. There were only scraps of old newspapers and bits of rusted iron. Every single packet which they had guarded was a hollow lie. The realization of the betrayal was like a physical blow that left him gasping for air. The miraculous eggs, the spirit voices of Mrs. Moore, the sacred pudding, it had all been a meticulously crafted trap designed to strip them of their dignity and then eliminate them as witnesses. William didn't return to Mary's cottage. He dragged his weakened body to the local magistrate's office, his voice trembling as he told the story. When the authorities finally raided Mary's home, they found a hidden compartment filled with arsenic and mercury. During the trial in 1809, the courtroom was a sea of angry, disillusioned faces. People who had once sought Mary's counsel now looked at her with a mixture of hatred and profound revulsion. Medical experts testified that the pudding had been saturated with mercuric chloride, a corrosive poison that causes a slow, agonizing death. Mary sat in the wooden dock, her face a mask of stone-cold indifference. She never confessed, even when faced with the stolen items of dozens of other victims who had died under her care. On the morning of her execution, a crowd of over 5,000 people descended upon the York Tyburn. The air was thick with a tense supernatural expectation. Many still believed that Mary would use her dark arts to escape the noose at the final second. But as the trapdoor fell, there was only the sound of a heavy snap and the creaking of the rope. Mary Bateman died without a word, her body hanging as a grim monument to the power of deception. The woman who claimed to control the spirits was now nothing more than a cold weight. However, the city was not quite finished with her. In a final morbid ritual of the era, Mary's body was taken to the general infirmary to be publicly dissected by the surgeons. Her skin was carefully removed and tanned, then cut into small ribbon-like strips. These pieces of witch skin were sold to the very people who had feared her marketed as magical talismans that could protect the wearer from bad luck. It was a final haunting transformation for a woman who had spent her entire life turning the fears of others into a profit. William Perigot survived the poisoning, but he remained a ghost of the man he once was. The mercury had left him with a permanent rhythmic shaking in his limbs and a voice that never rose above a whisper. He spent the remainder of his days in a quiet, lonely cottage, often seen staring out the window at the gray Leeds sky. He had sought a miracle to fix a world he didn't understand, and in doing so, he had invited a monster to sit at his table. He died a few years later, his heart finally giving out from the weight of grief. Today, the story of Mary Bateman serves as a chilling reminder of how easily our own hopes and fears can be weaponized against us. She didn't need a coven or a book of spells to destroy lives. She only needed to understand the deep, universal human desire for security in an uncertain world. As you lock your doors and settle in for the night, think about the people you trust and the stories you tell yourself to feel safe. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what is hiding in the dark, but the person smiling at you in the light. The legend of the Yorkshire Witch eventually settled into the history books, becoming a static image of a bygone era's superstitions. But as the 19th century marched forward, the patterns of human cruelty and the desperate fight for survival continued to repeat themselves in even more desolate places. Far away from the cramped, smoky alleys of Leeds, a different kind of survival story was unfolding on the edge of the world. One where a man wasn't fighting a hidden poisoner, but an entire tribe of people who had once been his captors. In the late summer of 1804, the American frontier was a place of deep, suffocating green. The Natchez Trace, an ancient trail cutting through the heart of the wilderness, was the only lifeline for travelers, but it felt more like a tunnel through a nightmare. Silas was a 24-year-old pioneer who had spent his life believing in the promise of the West. But as he navigated his wagon through the mud of Mississippi, he felt a strange, cold weight in the air. The trees were so thick, they seemed to swallow the sunlight, leaving the trail in a perpetual state of emerald twilight. Silas was used to the silence of the woods, but this was different. Usually there was the chatter of squirrels or the distant call of a bird, but today the forest was holding its breath. He gripped the reins of his horses, his knuckles white as he looked at the dense undergrowth. Everything felt too still, like a painting that was about to scream. He had heard the stories around the campfires back in Kentucky. They spoke of the Harpes, two brothers, Makaja and Wiley, who were less like men and more like forces of nature. They didn't just rob people. They seemed to take a visceral pleasure in the act of destruction. Travelers would mention finding abandoned wagons with the horses still hitched but no drivers in sight. The frontier was a place where people went to disappear, but the Harps were making sure they never came back. Silas pulled his wagon to a stop near a small creek to let his horses drink. He stepped down into the tall grass, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy flintlock rifle leaning against the seat. The water was clear and shallow, rippling over smooth stones. But as Silas looked closer at the bank, he noticed something that made the hair on his neck stand up. There was a patch of mud that had been churned up and half buried. In the silt was a single mud-caked leather boot. It was a small boot, likely belonging to a child. Silas felt a cold shiver run down his spine despite the humid heat of the afternoon. He told himself it was just a lost item, something dropped by a passing family. But there were no wagon tracks leading to this spot, and the boot looked like it had been forced into the mud with a heavy heel. He didn't stay to investigate. He climbed back onto his wagon and drove his horses harder than he ever had before, the silence of the woods now feeling like a threat. A few days later, Silas arrived at a small settlement where a group of local militiamen were gathering. They were tired, dusty men with hard eyes and loaded rifles. They told Silas that a man had been captured near the town of Old Greenville. He was a rough-looking character who went by the name of John Seton. He had been caught after a series of small robberies, and the townspeople were keeping him in a makeshift cell until a circuit judge could arrive to hear the case. Silas, feeling a sense of civic duty and a lingering fear from the trail, offered to help guard the prisoner. He walked toward the small log structure that served as the jail, the air smelling of pine pitch and wood smoke. Inside, sitting on a low wooden bench, was a man who looked like he had been dragged through every briar patch in the territory. He was lean and muscular, with matted hair and a beard that couldn't hide the sharp, predatory lines of his jaw. He looked completely unbothered. The prisoner looked up as Silas entered, and for a second their eyes met. Silas felt a sudden, sharp jolt of recognition, though he had never seen this man before. It was the eyes. They were a pale, watery blue, completely devoid of any warmth or human emotion. They didn't look like the eyes of a petty thief. They looked like the eyes of someone who had watched the world burn and found the sight amusing. Silas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he turned away. For 2 days, John Seton sat in that cell saying almost nothing. He ate the food they gave him with a mechanical efficiency, never asking about his trial or the charges against him. He just watched the guards with that same hollow stare. The townspeople began to feel a growing sense of unease. There was a heaviness in the air around the jail, a feeling that something far more dangerous than a robber was sitting in their midst, waiting for a moment to strike. The turning point came when a traveler from the north arrived in the settlement. He was a man named Moses Stegall, and he had a personal reason for hunting the harps. Years earlier, the brothers had stayed at his house and murdered his wife and infant son in a fit of senseless rage. When Moses walked into the jail and saw the prisoner sitting on the bench, his face turned a ghostly shade of white. He didn't see John Seton, he saw Wiley Harp, the younger and more cunning of the two brothers. The revelation hit the settlement like a lightning strike. The rumors of the Harp's brutality were legendary, but having one of them in a small log cell was a terrifying reality. People began to gather outside the jail, their voices low and angry. They spoke of the victims who had been found in the rivers, men and women who had been gutted and filled with stones so their bodies would sink to the bottom. It was a signature of the Harps, a way to make sure their crimes remained hidden in the deep. Wiley Harp, realizing his cover was blown, finally spoke. His voice was a low, rasping growl that sounded like stones grinding together. He didn't deny his identity. Instead, he began to recount his crimes with a chilling level of detail. He spoke of the lives he had taken along the Natchez Trace, describing the fear in his victims' eyes as if it were a precious memory. He showed no remorse, no fear of the gallows. He seemed to relish the terror he was causing, even while in chains. The trial was short. The evidence of his identity and his own boastful confessions were more than enough for the judge. Wiley Harpy was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for the very next morning, and the entire settlement stayed awake through the night. Silas stood guard outside the jail, his rifle clutched in his shaking hands. He could hear Wiley inside humming a low, tuneless melody that drifted through the cracks in the logs like a poisonous vapor. On the morning of the execution, the sky was a flat, dull gray. A makeshift gallows had been constructed in a clearing near the edge of the woods. A massive crowd had gathered people coming from miles away to see the end of the man who had turned the frontier into a slaughterhouse. Wiley was led out of the jail, his hands bound tightly with heavy hemp rope. He walked with a steady, arrogant stride, looking at the crowd with a sneer that made the braver men among them flinch. As he stood on the wooden platform, the executioner placed the noose around his neck. The air was so quiet, Silas could hear the rustle of the leaves in the nearby trees. The judge asked Wiley if he had any final words. Wiley looked at Moses Stegall, who was standing in the front row, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. He said nothing else. With the pull of a lever, the trapdoor fell, and the younger Hart brother was finally silenced by the weight of his own crimes. But for the people of Mississippi, a simple hanging wasn't enough to balance the scales of the lives Wiley had destroyed. They wanted a permanent message, something that would serve as a warning to any other outlaws who thought they could prey on the innocent. After the body was cut down, a local blacksmith stepped forward with a heavy, sharpened axe. In front of the silent, grim-faced crowd, he severed Wiley Harp's head from his shoulders with a single, powerful stroke. The crowd watched in a mixture of awe and revulsion as the head was taken to a nearby crossroads on the Natchez Trace. A tall, sturdy wooden stake had been driven deep into the earth. The head was hoisted up and hammered onto the top of the stake, its pale, watery eyes still staring out over the trail it had once haunted. It was a grisly, primitive monument, a piece of the nightmare left behind to rot in the sun as a testament to the price of such absolute evil. For years, that head remained on the stake, bleaching in the wind and rain until it was nothing more than a white, hollow skull. Travelers would avoid that stretch of the road at night, claiming they could hear a low, rasping voice whispering from the shadows. The crossroads became a landmark of terror. a place where the air always felt a few degrees colder. Even after the skull was gone, the memory of what had been placed there lingered in the soil like a permanent stain. Today, that stretch of road in Mississippi is still known by the name the pioneers gave it, Harp's Head Road. It is a quiet, paved street now, surrounded by trees and modern homes, but the name remains a chilling echo of a time when the law was a fragile thing. People drive over that ground every day, unaware that beneath the asphalt lies the history of America's first serial killer and the brutal, visceral end he met at the hands of the people he tried to break. Silas eventually moved further west, leaving the Natchez Trace and its ghosts behind. But he never forgot the feeling of those pale blue eyes or the sight of the leather boot in the mud. He realized that the frontier wasn't just a place of opportunity, it was a place where the human spirit could be tested to its absolute limit. He lived to be an old man, but he always kept his rifle close to his bed, knowing that the shadows of the past have a way of following you. Wiley Harp was a man who lost his humanity by choice, trading his soul for a few years of violent power. He thought he was the apex predator of the wilderness, but he learned too late that even the most vicious animal can be brought down by those who stand together. His head on that stake was more than just a punishment. It was a boundary line marking the end of one kind of world and the beginning of another where justice carried a very heavy blade. The story of the Harps is a dark thread woven into the fabric of the American story, a reminder that the wild places of the world can harbor monsters that look just like us. As you drive through the quiet parts of the country tonight, and the trees seem to lean a little closer to your windows, remember the Natchez Trace. Remember that some roads are named for the things we want to forget, but the names are there to make sure we never truly do. Wiley Harp was a man who chose to be a beast, and his final image was one of absolute silent ruin. But in a forest in France just a few years earlier, a boy had been found who was the exact opposite. He hadn't chosen to be wild. He had been shaped by the woods themselves, a creature of the leaves and the snow who had never known the touch of another human hand. He was a boy with a scar on his throat and a mystery in his eyes that no science could solve. In the early spring of 1800, the mountains of Aveyron in southern France were a place of absolute untamed beauty. The air was crisp and carried the sharp, clean scent of pine needles and damp earth. For a group of local hunters, these woods were their backyard, a familiar terrain where every trail and stream was mapped out in their minds. They had spent their lives tracking deer and boar through the dense thickets and rocky slopes of the region. On this particular morning, the sun was just beginning to peek over the ridges, casting long golden fingers of light through the thick canopy. The hunters were moving silently, their boots barely making a sound on the soft, thick carpet of moss. They were focused on the hunt, their senses tuned to the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. It was a normal day in a life that had remained unchanged for generations, defined by the slow, steady rhythm of the forest. However, as they approached a small clearing near the edge of a deep-shadowed ravine, one of the men noticed a movement that did not fit the patterns of the woods. It was not the heavy rhythmic gait of a boar or the light skittish leap of a deer. It was something smaller, faster, and much more chaotic. The hunters dropped to their knees, their hands tightening on their rifles as they peered through the thick ferns trying to make sense of the strange dark shape. Through the dappled light, they saw a creature darting between the ancient trees with a terrifying fluid grace. It was naked, its skin a dark weathered brown that looked more like tree bark than human flesh. At first, they thought it was some kind of strange ape that had somehow found its way into the French mountains. But as the creature stopped for a second to dig in the dirt, the hunters felt a cold, sudden jolt of realization. It was not an animal. It was a boy. The boy looked to be about 12 years old, his hair a matted, wild tangle of leaves, twigs, and dirt. He was moving on all fours, his fingers curved like claws as he scavenged for roots and berries. The hunters watched in a stunned, heavy silence, their breath catching in their throats. They had heard rumors of wild men in the woods, but seeing this child completely detached from the human world felt like a crack had opened in the very foundation of their reality. They decided they could not leave him there. They moved forward, trying to encircle the boy without scaring him off into the deeper brush. But as soon as they broke cover, the boy's head snapped up. His eyes did not look like a child's eyes. They were wide black and filled with a primal, predatory intensity. He did not scream or call for help. He let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in his chest, a sound that belonged more to a wolf than a human being. A frantic chase ensued through the thorns and the sharp rocks. The boy was incredibly fast, leaping over fallen logs and scaling steep embankments with a strength that seemed impossible for his small frame. The hunters were gasping for air, their clothes torn by the brush, as they finally cornered him against a sheer rock face. Even then, the boy fought with a desperate animalistic fury, biting and scratching, until they finally managed to throw a heavy coat over him. As they carried the struggling bundle back toward the village, the initial excitement of the capture began to fade into a deep, heavy sense of unease. The boy did not act like a frightened child. He did not cry for his mother or show any sign of understanding the men's voices. He just lay there, his body tense and coiled like a spring, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were looking for the perfect moment to tear out a throat and vanish back into the trees. News of the wild boy of Aveyron spread across France like a wildfire, eventually reaching the ears of the scientific elite in Paris. This was the dawn of the Enlightenment, a time when scholars were obsessed with the idea of the natural man. They wanted to know if a human could exist without society, and the boy, who they eventually named Victor, was the perfect subject. He was taken from the quiet mountains and thrust into the cold, clinical world of the city. Among those most fascinated by Victor was a young doctor named Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard. He was a man of immense patience and a firm believer that anyone could be civilized through education and care. He saw Victor not as a monster, but as a blank slate, a human soul that had simply never been given the tools of language and culture. Itard moved Victor into his own home, determined to bridge the gap between the wild forest and the human world he lived in. But as Itard began his work, he started to notice details about Victor that defied all medical logic. The boy seemed to be completely immune to the environment. During the dead of winter, when the windows were frosted over, Victor would strip off his clothes and run out into the snow, sitting for hours without a single shiver. His skin remained warm to the touch, and he never showed signs of a cold or a fever. It was as if his body had forgotten the feeling of cold. Even more disturbing was Victor's relationship with pain. One afternoon, Itard watched as Victor reached into a blazing hearth to grab a roasted potato that had fallen into the embers. The boy's hand was surrounded by orange flames, and the smell of singed flesh filled the room. Yet Victor did not flinch. He did not pull his hand away in agony. He simply retrieved the potato and began to eat it, his face a mask of absolute terrifying indifference to the searing heat. These physical anomalies were just the beginning of the mystery. As Itard spent more time studying Victor's body, he found a series of deep silver scars. Most were small, likely from years of running through thorns and over sharp rocks. But there was one scar that stood out from the rest. It was a thick, jagged line that ran horizontally across Victor's throat from one side of his neck to the other. It was clearly the result of a deliberate, violent act. The doctor realized that Victor had not just been lost in the woods. Someone had taken a sharp blade to that child's throat and left him for dead in the wilderness. The boy had not grown up in the forest because he was abandoned. He had survived a murder attempt that should have ended his life. The forest had not been his enemy, it had been his sanctuary. The wild had taken in the boy that the human world had tried to discard and destroy with such absolute cruelty. This realization changed the way Itard looked at his student. He began to see Victor's silence not as a lack of intelligence, but as a profound internal wall. Every time the doctor tried to teach him a word or a letter, he saw the same look in Victor's eyes, a mixture of confusion and a deep, aching longing for the trees. The boy would spend hours sitting by the window, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the wind move through the branches of the park. In an attempt to awaken Victor's senses, Itard introduced him to a large mirror. Victor stood before the glass, his eyes widening as he saw another boy staring back at him. He reached out to touch the surface, his fingers meeting the cold, smooth reflection. For a moment, he seemed to think he had found a companion. But when he moved behind the mirror and found only the wall, he let out a sharp, bird-like cry of disappointment. It was a look at a soul that was alone. For months, Itard used every technique he knew. He tried to reward Victor with sweets, he tried to use rhythmic sounds, and he even tried to use mild electric shocks to stimulate his senses. There were small victories. Victor learned to set a table, he learned to wear a simple tunic, and he eventually learned to recognize the meaning of a few written words. But the vital spark of human connection, the ability to share a thought through language, remained out of reach. The most heartbreaking moments occurred when Victor would try to communicate his own feelings. He would grab Itard's hand and lead him to the door, his eyes filled with an intensity that transcended words. He was not asking for food or warmth, he was asking for the silence of the Aberon Mountains. He was asking for the world where he did not have to be a subject or a miracle. He was a prisoner of the doctor's kindness, trapped in a house that felt like a cage. On one rare occasion, Victor showed a glimmer of emotional depth. Itard had been scolding him for a minor mistake, and for the first time, Victor's eyes welled up with tears. He did not growl or run away. He simply sat there, the tears rolling down his cheeks, as he looked at the doctor with a look of pure human sorrow. Itard felt a lump form in his own throat. He realized that Victor was capable of feeling love and shame, even if he could not find the words to say it. Despite these breakthroughs, Victor never fully assimilated. He remained fascinated by the natural world, often spending hours watching raindrops crawl down the window pane. He seemed to find a peace in the rhythm of the rain that he could never find in the voices of people. To him, the world of society was a series of loud, confusing noises and arbitrary rules. He was a creature of the earth who had been forced to live in a world of symbols and cold gray stone. As the years passed, the public's interest in the wild boy began to fade. The scholars in Paris moved on to newer mysteries, and Victor became a forgotten relic of a scientific experiment. He was no longer the star of the salons, he was just a man who did not speak, living in a small cottage on the outskirts of the city. He spent his days in the garden, his hands constantly in the dirt, as if he were trying to maintain some connection to the soil that had once saved him. Victor lived under the care of a devoted governess named Madame Guérin, who treated him like her own son. She was the only person who could truly calm him when the wildness returned. During thunderstorms, Victor would become agitated, his breathing becoming fast and shallow as he paced the floor. She would sit with him, holding his hand and singing soft lullabies until the tension left his body. She was the bridge between his two worlds, the only one he truly trusted. He eventually learned to say two words, though he rarely used them. One was Leda, the French word for milk, which he would mutter when he was hungry. The other was "Oh Dieu," which he had heard the doctor exclaim in moments of frustration. Hearing these sounds coming from Victor's throat was both a miracle and a tragedy. They were the only pieces of human language he had managed to claim, small, broken fragments of a world he would never truly be a part of in his life. Victor died in 1828, his heart finally giving out when he was in his early 40s. When they laid him out for burial, they found that the scar on his throat was still the most prominent feature of his weathered, silent face. It was a final, haunting reminder of the violence that had sent him into the woods and the resilience that had kept him alive. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a man who had lived his life as a ghost in the city. To this day, the story of Victor of Aveyron remains a haunting question mark in the history of human nature. He was a boy who survived the unthinkable, only to find that the world he came from was far more dangerous and confusing than the one he had mastered. He was a survivor of the highest order, but he was also a victim of a society that wanted to turn his trauma into a lesson. He remains a symbol of the wild spirit that lives within us, all just beneath the skin. When modern psychologists look back at Victor's case, they see a child who likely suffered from severe autism or developmental delays made worse by years of isolation. But for those who saw him in 1800, he was something more. He was a mirror reflecting the hidden parts of the human soul. He showed them that we are only civilized because we are taught to be, and that without the voices of others, we are just another part of the forest, silent and wild. As you look out your window tonight at the dark line of trees at the edge of your yard, think about the boy with the scar. Think about the world he knew, where pain and cold were just parts of the air, and where the only law was the rhythm of the seasons. Victor was a man who forgot how to be human so that he could stay alive, and in the end, that was his greatest victory and his most profound tragedy. He was the boy who truly knew the deep, heavy silence of the world. His life was a testament to the fact that the human spirit can endure almost anything, but it also shows the limits of our understanding. We wanted Victor to be a miracle, but he just wanted to be home. We wanted him to speak, but his silence was the most profound thing about him. He left behind a legacy of questions that we still have not answered, a lingering afterimage of a child running through the snow, free from the weight of words and the expectations of men. The story of Victor is a reminder that the most important parts of us are often the ones we cannot explain or categorize. He was not a blank slate. He was a finished story that we simply did not know how to read. As the wind whistles through the eaves of your house tonight, remember that there are things in the world that refuse to be tamed, and that sometimes the most human thing we can do is simply allow them to be wild. Victor was a ghost who refused to be haunting. Victor's mystery was one of the mind and the soul, a silent battle fought in the quiet rooms of Paris. But for some, the struggle for survival is not a slow process of learning and longing. It is a sudden, violent explosion that tears their world apart in a single bloody heartbeat. While Victor was trying to find his voice in France, a young man named John Jewett was about to find himself in a situation where his only choice was to become a different kind of ghost in a dangerous land. At 10 o'clock on a crisp morning in March of 1803, a 24-year-old blacksmith named John Jewett was standing on the deck of the American ship Boston. The vessel was anchored in the calm, glassy waters of Nootka Sound on the rugged coast of what we now call Vancouver Island. The air was cool and smelled of cedar and salt, and the surrounding mountains were draped in a thick emerald green forest that seemed to touch the sky. To John, this felt like the height of adventure. He had grown up in England learning the art of the forge from his father, but he had always felt a pull toward the horizon. He was a skilled artisan, a man who understood the language of heat and hammer, and he had been hired to maintain the ship's tools and ironwork. For him, the Boston was more than just a merchant ship, it was a floating workshop where he could practice his craft while seeing parts of the world few would ever imagine. The atmosphere on the ship was one of busy, productive peace. For several days, the crew had been trading with the local indigenous people, the Moachat. Their leader, a powerful and dignified man named Chief McQuina, had been a frequent guest on the deck. The exchange was going well. The Americans wanted valuable sea otter pelts, and the locals were interested in blankets, knives, and iron goods. John spent his time at his portable forge, repairing hinges and sharpening blades. John genuinely enjoyed the presence of the Moachat people. He found their culture fascinating and their craftsmanship impressive. He would often look up from his anvil to see them watching him, their eyes filled with curiosity at the way he could turn a glowing rod of iron into a precise tool. There was a mutual respect there, a quiet understanding between builders. To John, these were not just trading partners, they were neighbors in a vast, beautiful wilderness. However, beneath this surface of peaceful trade, a small, jagged crack was beginning to form. The captain of the Boston, a man named John Salter, was a veteran sailor, but a man of limited patience and even less cultural awareness. He saw the locals as obstacles to be managed rather than people to be respected. He was focused entirely on his profit margins and his schedule, and he often treated the visiting chiefs with a level of condescension that made the air on the deck feel heavy. The first real sign of trouble occurred when Chief McQuina brought a fowling piece, a type of shotgun, back to the ship. He had purchased it from the captain a few days earlier, but the lock was broken. He presented it to Salter, expecting a simple repair or a replacement. Instead of seeing an opportunity to provide good customer service, Salter saw an annoyance. He took the gun, examined it briefly, and then threw it back at the chief with a string of insults. John Jewett was standing only a few feet away, his hammer frozen in midair. He saw the way the chief's face tightened, his eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. McKenna did not shout or argue. He simply picked up the broken gun, turned on his heel, and walked toward his canoe without looking back. Salter just laughed and returned to his cabin, seemingly unaware that he had just ignited a fire in a place where the wood was very dry and the wind was beginning to rise. For the next 2 days, the sound was unnaturally quiet. The canoes that had once swarmed around the Boston were nowhere to be seen. John felt a persistent cold knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He mentioned it to the first mate, but he was told that the locals were likely just busy with their own affairs. To the crew, it was a welcome break from the noise of trade. They spent their time cleaning the deck and mending the sails, thinking that their world was still safe. On the morning of March 22nd, the silence was finally broken. A fleet of canoes appeared on the horizon, led by McKenna himself. He was smiling and appeared to be in a festive mood, telling Captain Salter that his people were planning a great feast and wanted to provide the crew with fresh salmon as a gesture of goodwill. Salter, feeling that he had successfully managed the chief, accepted the invitation and ordered his men to prepare for a day of relaxation. John was below deck in his workshop, the rhythmic clanging of his hammer on the anvil providing a steady, comforting heartbeat for the ship. He was working on a set of new hinges for the captain's quarters, his mind focused on the heat of the coal and the shape of the iron. He heard the sounds of the crew laughing and talking with the visitors above him. It sounded like any other day of successful trade, a celebration of the bounty of the sea and the friendship of men. Then the laughter was replaced by a sound that made John's blood turn to ice. It wasn't a shout or a cheer, it was a sudden, sharp explosion of screams that echoed through the wooden timbers of the hull. He heard the heavy thud of bodies hitting the deck and the discordant clatter of metal on wood. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, and his breath came in short, jagged gasps. He knew with a visceral, instinctive certainty that his peaceful world had just ended. John grabbed a heavy iron bar and moved toward the companionway, but before he could reach the stairs, a heavy wooden hatch was thrown back. A group of warriors looked down at him, their faces painted for war. One of them lunged at him with a spear, the sharp stone tip grazing John's forehead and sending a warm, sticky stream of blood into his eyes. He fell back against his anvil, his vision blurring as he was dragged up the stairs and onto the main deck of the Boston. What he saw there was a nightmare that no amount of self-reassurance could explain away. The deck, which had been clean and white only an hour before, was now a visceral, saturated red. The entire crew, 25 men he had worked and lived with for months, had been slaughtered. Their bodies lay in tangled heaps near the railings, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute shock. John felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his legs feeling weak and unresponsive. He was forced to his knees in the center of the deck, surrounded by warriors holding blood-stained clubs. Chief McQuinna stepped forward, his eyes no longer smiling. He looked at John, then at the portable forge that sat nearby. He reached out and touched the iron bar John had been using. He spoke in his native language, but the meaning was clear. He had seen John's skill. He knew that a man who could command fire and iron was more valuable than a dead sailor. McKenna gave John a choice that was no choice at all. He could live as the chief's slave, using his skills to forge weapons and tools for the tribe, or he could join his shipmates in the dark water of the Sound. John looked at the faces of his friends, and then at the cold black eyes of the chief. He nodded slowly, his voice a broken whisper, as he agreed to the terms. He was no longer a blacksmith of the American Merchant Marine. He was a living tool of the Moachot. Before they left the ship, McQuinna ordered a final horrific task. He forced John to stand by the railing as the warriors brought out a series of wooden baskets. One by one, they placed the severed heads of the 25 crew members on the deck, arranged in a long, neat line. John had to identify each one by name, his voice trembling as he looked into the sightless eyes of men who had been his family. It was a ritual of total subjugation, a way to break his spirit completely. The Moachot then set fire to the Boston. John watched from the shore as the ship that had been his home for so long became a towering pillar of orange flame. The masts collapsed into the water with a sound like a thunderclap, and the hull slowly hissed into the deep. He was now a ghost in a foreign land, a man without a country, a name, or a future. He was taken to the village, where he was given a small corner of a longhouse and told that his life belonged to the forge. For the next 2 years, John Jewett lived a life that felt like a slow waking dream. He spent his days in a small hut at the edge of the village, the heat of his forge, the only thing that felt familiar. He made daggers, spearheads, and fishhooks for the people who had murdered his friends. He learned their language, participated in their rituals, and even took a wife from the tribe as a way to ensure his survival. But every night he would sit by the water and look at the horizon. He kept a secret journal using a small bottle of ink he had salvaged from the ship, and later using the juice of wild berries when the ink ran out. He wrote on scraps of paper he had hidden in his clothes, recording the names of the dead and the details of his daily life. Writing was his only anchor to his old self, a way to prove to the darkness that John Jewett still existed. He lived in a state of constant low-level terror, knowing that a single mistake could lead to his execution. He noticed small, strange details about his captors that the other sailors had missed. He saw the way they respected the spirits of the animals they hunted and the deep rhythmic connection they had to the cycles of the moon and the tides. He began to understand that they weren't the savages Captain Salter had described, but a complex, deeply spiritual people who had been pushed to a violent breaking point by a man who refused to see them as human beings. Despite this understanding, the trauma of the massacre remained a permanent shadow over his mind. He would often wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he could hear the screams of his crew or the sound of the axes hitting the wooden deck. He felt a profound, crushing sense of guilt for being the one who lived. He wondered if his life was worth the price of his friends' deaths, and if he was becoming a monster himself by forging the weapons of his captors. In 1805, after 741 days of captivity, a sail finally appeared on the horizon. It was an American ship called the Lydia. John knew this was his only chance. He convinced McKenna to let him go out to the ship to trade, promising to bring back more iron goods. Once on board, he revealed his true identity to the captain. The rescue was swift and tense, with the Lydia's crew holding McKenna hostage until John was safely on board. When John finally stepped back onto an American deck, he didn't feel the rush of joy he had expected. He felt a strange, hollow sense of displacement. He was covered in traditional tattoos, his skin was weathered by the sun and smoke, and his English was slow and rusty. He looked in a mirror for the first time in 2 years and didn't recognize the man staring back. He was a survivor, but he was also a living monument to a tragedy that the world was eager to forget. John eventually returned to the East Coast, where he published his journal. His story became a sensation, a captivity narrative that was read by thousands. But for John, the fame was a secondary trauma. He spent the rest of his life traveling from town to town, performing his story on stages, dressed in the very clothes he had worn as a slave. He was trapped in a cycle of reliving his nightmare every night for a paying audience, his own life becoming a commodity. He died in 1821, a man who had survived a massacre but never truly escaped the sound of the forge. He left behind a haunting legacy, a story of how a single act of arrogance can destroy dozens of lives and how the human spirit can adapt to the unthinkable just to keep breathing. He was a man who lived between two worlds, a blacksmith who had seen the fire of the forge and the fire of the ship and found them to be the same. Today, the waters of Nootka Sound are as calm and glassy as they were in 1803. The kauri trees and the cedars still watch the tides, and the memory of the Boston is buried deep in the silt of the ocean floor. John Jewett's journal remains a chilling look at a world where the line between guest and prisoner is as thin as a blade. It is a reminder that we are all just one bad decision away from becoming a ghost in our own lives. As you listen to the wind outside your house tonight, think about the sound of a hammer on an anvil. Think about the way a routine can become a trap, and how a beautiful view can become a prison. John Jewett waited 2 years for his justice, his life held together by berry juice and iron. But for some, the wait for justice takes much longer. And the crime isn't a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, calculated betrayal by someone who was supposed to be a leader. John Jewett's ordeal was a struggle for physical survival against an external force, a fight to keep his heart beating in a land that wanted him for his labor. But as the 19th century dawned, others were facing a different kind of survival, a struggle for the soul of the law itself. While John was forge welding iron in the wilderness, the people of London were watching a very different kind of prisoner, a man of high status who had spent 20 years running from a ghost he created. At 10 o'clock on a cold, damp Tuesday morning in January of 1802, a 64-year-old man named Joseph Wall sat in the study of his comfortable London home. Outside, the fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the iron railings and the cobblestone streets, turning the city into a ghost of itself. Inside, the fire was crackling softly, and the room was filled with the familiar dusty scent of leather-bound books and expensive tobacco. Joseph was a man of high status, a retired officer who had spent his life commanding men in the far reaches of the British Empire. To his neighbors, he was the picture of a respectable gentleman enjoying a quiet, well-earned retirement. For several months, Joseph had been living this peaceful routine. He would spend his mornings reading the newspapers and his afternoons taking long, solitary walks through the park, his heavy cane clicking rhythmically on the pavement. He was a tall, imposing figure with a face that looked like it had been carved from old oak, weathered by years of sun and service. He rarely spoke to others, but when he did, his voice carried a natural authority that discouraged any casual conversation. To everyone in the neighborhood, Joseph Wall was simply another veteran of the wars, a man who had seen the world and finally come home to rest. However, beneath the surface of this quiet life, Joseph was a man living on a knife's edge. He never sat with his back to a door, and he always kept a small loaded pistol in the drawer of his desk. Every time there was a sudden noise in the street, the shout of a fruit seller or the rattle of a passing carriage, his body would go rigid and his hand would move instinctively toward the pocket of his coat. He was a man who had spent 20 years running from a memory, a ghost, that he thought he had finally left behind in the humid, blood-stained heat of a distant island in Africa. The first real sign that his world was beginning to crack occurred when there was a sharp, rhythmic knocking at his front door. It wasn't the polite, tentative knock of a delivery boy or a neighbor. It was a loud, heavy sound that echoed through the hallway like a drumbeat. Joseph felt a sudden, sharp jolt of adrenaline hit his heart, and his breath caught in his throat. He sat perfectly still in his chair, his fingers digging into the velvet armrests until his knuckles turned white. He watched the door of his study, waiting for his servant to answer, his ears straining to catch any sound of voices from the foyer. When the door finally opened, it wasn't a friend or a colleague who walked in. It was two officers from the magistrate's office, their faces grim and their eyes fixed on Joseph with a look of cold professional intensity. They didn't offer any pleasantries. They simply informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of a man named Benjamin Armstrong. The name hit Joseph like a physical blow, a sound he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 2 decades. In an instant, the comfortable study and the crackling fire vanished, and he was back in the suffocating heat of 1782. To understand why a retired gentleman was being arrested for a crime committed 20 years ago, we have to look back at the island of Gorée off the coast of Senegal. In 1782, Joseph Wall was the governor of the colony, a small, isolated outpost where the British garrison lived in a state of constant, low-level misery. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rotting vegetation, and the heat was so intense it felt like a physical weight on the chest. The soldiers were hungry, tired, and frustrated as they hadn't been paid in months and were living on dwindling rations. Among the soldiers was a young man named Benjamin Armstrong. He was a popular figure in the barracks, known for his steady nerves and his willingness to speak up for his fellow soldiers. On a particularly sweltering afternoon, a small group of soldiers, led by Armstrong, approached the governor's house. They weren't armed and they weren't looking for a fight. They simply wanted to ask about their back pay, as they were scheduled to leave the island the next morning and feared they would never see the money they had earned through years of grueling service in the tropics. Joseph Wall watched the men approach from his balcony, his eyes narrowing with a cold, aristocratic rage. He didn't see a group of hard-working soldiers asking for their due, he saw a mutiny in the making. He was a man who believed that authority was absolute, and that any form of questioning was a direct attack on the crown itself. He ordered the men to return to their barracks, his voice a low, rasping growl that carried over the sound of the surf. When the men hesitated, hoping for a real answer, Joseph made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He didn't call for a court-martial, and he didn't follow any of the established military procedures for discipline. Instead, he ordered the entire garrison to assemble in the center of the fort. The soldiers stood in long, straight lines, their faces glistening with sweat as the governor paced back and forth in front of them. He pointed to Benjamin Armstrong and ordered him to be stripped to the waist and tied to the carriage of a heavy iron cannon. The air in the fort was so quiet that the only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the stone walls and the heavy breathing of the men. In those days, military floggings were common, but they were usually performed with a standard whip called a cat-o'-nine-tails. Joseph Wall, however, wanted something more visceral. He ordered the executioner to use a heavy 5-inch thick rope, a piece of cordage normally used for securing the sails of a ship. He then gave a command that made the veteran soldiers in the lines turn pale with shock. He ordered that Benjamin Armstrong be given 800 lashes. It was a death sentence in everything but name, a punishment so extreme that no human body was built to survive it. The punishment began under the blazing African sun. 2 black laborers who were not part of the military were forced to perform the whipping, with Joseph standing only a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. Every time the heavy rope hit Armstrong's back, it made a sound like a wet cloth hitting a stone. The young soldier didn't scream at first. He just groaned, his body jerking with every impact as the skin on his back began to tear. Joseph watched with a look of absolute stone-cold indifference, occasionally leaning forward to shout, "Lay on you, black scoundrels," or "I'll have you in his place." As the count reached 100, the physical reality of the punishment became a nightmare. The white skin of Armstrong's back had been replaced by a raw, saturated red, and the smell of copper-scented blood began to fill the air. The soldiers in the lines were forced to watch their hands shaking as they gripped their rifles, several of them turning their heads away in a mixture of grief and profound revulsion. But Joseph was relentless. He continued to count, his voice steady and calm, as if he were counting barrels of flour or crates of timber instead of the life of a human being. By the time the count reached 500, Benjamin Armstrong was no longer a man. He was a heap of broken flesh tied to an iron gun. His voice had failed him, and the only sound coming from his throat was a low rhythmic wheezing. The heavy rope was now soaked in blood, making a sickening heavy thud with every swing. The laborers were exhausted, their own muscles trembling from the effort, but Joseph threatened to have them whipped as well if they slowed down. He wanted the full 800, and he wanted them delivered with the maximum amount of force possible. When the punishment was finally over, Armstrong was untied and allowed to fall into the dirt. He was taken to the infirmary, where the surgeon looked at his back and simply shook his head. There was nothing that could be done. The rope had not just torn the skin, it had bruised the internal organs and shattered the spirit. Armstrong lived for 5 agonizing days, his body consumed by a fever and an infection that no medicine of the era could touch. He died in a small, shadowed room in the fort, his last words a whispered plea for a justice he would never see on that island. Joseph Wall left Guri the very next day, convinced that he had successfully crushed a rebellion. But when he arrived back in England, he found that the story of the 800 lashes had traveled faster than his ship. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but Joseph was a wealthy man with powerful connections. He managed to escape to the European continent, where he lived for 20 years under a series of assumed names. He moved from city to city, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the hand of the law to reach out from the shadows and grab him. For 2 decades, he believed he had outrun the ghost of Benjamin Armstrong. He eventually returned to London in 1801, thinking that enough time had passed for the witnesses to have died or forgotten. He thought that a crime committed 20 years ago in a distant colony was no longer relevant to the modern civilized world. He settled into his quiet house, built his routine, and allowed himself to feel a false sense of security. He forgot that the law has a very long memory and that the voices of the dead can carry across an entire ocean if the crime is loud enough. When his trial finally began in 1802, the courtroom was a sea of grim, expectant faces. To Joseph's horror, the witnesses had not disappeared. Several of the soldiers who had stood in those lines in Goree were now old men, their hair gray and their backs bent by time, but their memories of that afternoon were as sharp as a blade. One by one, they took the stand and described the sound of the rope, the smell of the blood, and the cold, unyielding look in the governor's eyes. They spoke for the man who could no longer speak for himself, their words filling the room with a visceral, living dread. Joseph's defense was that he had acted to prevent a mutiny and that as a governor, he had the absolute right to use any means necessary to maintain order. But the prosecution pointed to the 5-inch rope and the lack of a trial. They argued that Joseph Wall had not been a leader protecting his men, he had been a butcher satisfying his own rage. The jury only needed 30 minutes to reach their verdict. When the foreman stood up and said the word guilty, a cheer erupted from the crowd outside the courthouse that could be heard all the way to the river. On the morning of his execution, Joseph Wall was led to the gallows at Newgate Prison. A crowd of over 20,000 people had gathered to see the man who thought he was above the law. As he stood on the wooden platform, the air was filled with a sound that few executioners had ever heard. Not a silence or a prayer, but a roar of absolute collective joy from the spectators. They weren't there for a tragedy. They were there for a balancing of the scales. Joseph Wall, the man who had ordered 800 lashes with a heavy rope, was now facing the final absolute judgment of the noose. As the trapdoor fell and Joseph's life ended in a violent, sudden snap, the story of Benjamin Armstrong finally reached its conclusion. It was a case that proved that the passage of time does not erase the truth, and that a powerful man can walk for 20 years before his shadow finally catches up to him. The ghost of the soldier in Goree was finally at rest, and the governor, who had tried to play God, was now just another name in the grim records of Newgate. It was a victory for the common man and a warning to those who believe that distance and status can hide the blood on their hands. Joseph Wall's body was taken away for dissection, a final humiliation for a man who had treated the bodies of others with such absolute disregard. The study in his London home remained empty for months, the fire cold and the books gathering dust. The fog continued to roll through the streets, but the city felt a little lighter, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted from its conscience. The law had spoken, and it had said that every life has a value that cannot be measured in status or gold. It was a lesson that the 19th century would carry forward into its own uncertain future. The Governor Wall case remains a haunting reminder that justice is not a sprint, but a marathon. It is a story about the weight of memory and the way a single moment of cruelty can define a man's entire legacy. As you sit in your own quiet room tonight, listening to the sounds of the modern world, remember that the past is never truly gone. It is a shadow that follows us, a silent witness to every choice we make. Some people spend their lives building a future, while others spend their lives trying to outrun a single afternoon in the heat of a distant island. Joseph Wall thought he was a hero of the empire, but history remembers him only as the man with the rope. His name is a footnote in the records of the law, a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the resilience of the truth. As the lights go out in the city of London and the fog settles over the river, the echoes of the 800 lashes have finally faded into the silence of history. But the lesson remains etched into the stone of the courtrooms and the minds of those who believe that no one, no matter how powerful, is beyond the reach of a ghost seeking its rest. Wall's justice was 20 years in the making, a slow-motion collision between a man and his own dark history. It was an ending that felt like a beginning for the rights of the common soldier. But while the law was finding its voice in London, others were facing a much more immediate and visceral form of survival. Far away from the courtrooms and the gallows in the wild, uncharted territories of the world, people were discovering that the only law that truly matters is the one you carry with you in your heart and the strength of the hands that help you stand. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning on a humid Tuesday in July of 1994, a 31-year-old single mother named Sarah was sitting on the edge of her bed in a small, freshly painted rental house in suburban Ohio. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people still left their front doors unlocked, and the only sound at night was the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the tall grass of the nearby fields. Sarah had moved here 3 days ago, hoping for a fresh start. But on this particular night, Sarah was at her breaking point. Her 6-month-old son Leo had been crying for nearly 4 hours straight. It was that frantic, high-pitched colic scream that seems to vibrate inside your skull. She had tried everything from rocking him to driving him around the block in her old sedan, but nothing worked. The silence of the new house only made the baby's cries feel louder, bouncing off the empty walls and uncarpeted floors of the nursery. Before we go any further into what Sarah found in that house, I want to welcome you to the show. Today, we are looking at a series of events that prove the things intended to bring us peace can sometimes be the most dangerous. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. We have 3 stories to share with you tonight that will make you rethink the quiet corners of your own home. While you are settling in, please consider gently tapping the like button. I am not asking you to smash it, just give it a polite, quiet tap, almost like you are trying not to wake a sleeping baby. If you do it correctly, it might just keep the shadows in your hallway from moving when you turn your back. It really helps the channel, and it keeps these stories coming. Now, make sure your doors are locked, check your security cameras, and let's get back to Sarah. Exhausted and leaning against the nursery wall, Sarah noticed a small built-in wooden cube you hadn't seen before. It was painted the same off-white color as the baseboards, making it nearly invisible. Desperate for anything to distract herself, she reached down and pulled the tiny brass latch. Inside, tucked away in the back corner of the dusty shelf, was a single, unlabeled cassette tape sitting in a cracked plastic case. There was no writing on the tape, just a hand-drawn symbol of a crescent moon on the clear plastic. Sarah remembered seeing an old cassette player in the kitchen that the previous tenants had left behind. She picked up Leo, who was still sobbing into her shoulder, and walked down the creaky hallway. She pushed the tape into the player and hit the play button, expecting to hear some old pop music or perhaps a recorded church sermon. Instead, the speakers emitted a low pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate the very air in the kitchen. After a few seconds, a woman's voice began to sing a melody that Sarah didn't recognize. It was incredibly beautiful, but it had a strange dragging quality to it, as if the singer were falling asleep while performing. The lyrics were in a language Sarah couldn't identify, but the tone was so soothing that she felt her own heart rate begin to slow down. Within 1 minute of the music starting, Leo stopped crying. His little body went limp in her arms, his breathing becoming deep and regular. Sarah was stunned. She had never seen him fall asleep that fast in his entire life. She carefully carried him back to his crib, laid him down, and stood there for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall. The sleep spell on that tape was more effective than any medicine or rocking chair she had ever tried. For the next week, the tape became Sarah's secret weapon. Every night at 8 o'clock, she would play the unlabeled cassette, and every night, Leo would be asleep before the first verse was finished. Sarah was finally getting the rest she needed, and the house began to feel like a sanctuary. She even started playing the tape for herself when she struggled to wind down, finding that the strange rhythmic melody could knock her out in a matter of minutes. However, on the 10th night, the peaceful routine began to feel slightly off. Sarah was sitting in the living room reading a book while the tape played in the kitchen. As the music reached its halfway point, she noticed that the crickets outside had gone completely silent. Usually, the night was filled with their noise, but now the world outside her window felt as if it had been vacuum sealed. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that made the hair on her neck stand up. She stood up to turn off the player, but as she reached the kitchen doorway, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. The cassette player was spinning, but the volume was turned all the way down. She could still hear the lullaby, but it wasn't coming from the speakers. It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves, a muffled, vibrating chant that seemed to be originating from deep inside the house's structure. Sarah felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog, and realized she had been standing in the doorway for a long time. She looked at the clock on the stove and saw that 20 minutes had passed, yet she had no memory of it. It felt as if time were stretching and thinning, pulled by the gravity of that repetitive droning melody. She reached out and ejected the tape, and the music finally cut off into a dead silence. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling more tired than she had when the baby was crying all night. Her limbs felt like they were made of lead, and her mind was filled with a thick gray haze. She walked to the front porch to get the mail, and she noticed that her neighbor's dog, a golden retriever that usually barked at everything, was lying perfectly still on the lawn. She watched it for a full minute, but the animal didn't move a single muscle. She walked across the street to check on her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for this town, but the house was unnervingly quiet. Sarah called out for her, but there was no answer. She walked into the bedroom and found Mrs. Gable lying in bed, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Her breathing was so shallow that Sarah had to lean in close just to make sure the woman was still alive. Sarah tried to shake her awake, but Mrs. Gable was completely unresponsive. It wasn't a coma or a medical stroke. It looked like the woman was simply stuck in a state of profound, absolute sedation. As Sarah backed away in terror, she heard a sound coming from the small radio on the nightstand. It was turned off yet from the tiny speaker. She could hear the faint pulsing hum of the sleep spell lullaby drifting through the air. Panicked, Sarah ran back to her house to get Leo. She needed to leave to get as far away from this neighborhood as possible, but when she entered the nursery, she found Leo in the same state as Mrs. Gable. He was lying on his back, eyes open, staring at nothing, his little hands curled into fists. He wouldn't cry, he wouldn't move, and no matter how much she screamed his name, he remained trapped in that terrifyingly deep artificial slumber. She grabbed the cassette tape from the kitchen counter, intending to destroy it, but as she held it, she noticed the clear plastic was now warm to the touch. She realized with a jolt of horror that the hand-drawn crescent moon wasn't a symbol of sleep, it was a logo. She remembered an article she had read months ago about an experimental frequency study conducted by a nearby university in the late 70s that had been shut down by the government. The study had been looking for a way to induce mass sedation without the use of chemicals, using specific auditory frequencies to trigger a hibernative state in the human brain. The project had supposedly failed because they couldn't find a way to wake the subjects once the frequency had taken hold. Sarah looked at the tape in her hand and realized she hadn't found a lullaby. She had found a weapon that had been hidden away for 20 years. As the realization hit her, the music began to swell in the house again, louder than before. It wasn't just coming from the walls now, it was vibrating in her own teeth, a low-frequency hum that seemed to be shutting down her nervous system. She looked out the window and saw a car slowly roll through a stop sign and drift into a ditch. The driver slumped over the wheel in a waking trance. The entire cul-de-sac was being pulled into the deep. With her last bit of strength, Sarah grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and smashed the cassette tape into 1,000 shards of plastic and tangled brown film. The hum in the air immediately snapped, replaced by a sudden, jarring burst of static that made her ears ring. For a few seconds, the world remained perfectly still. Then, from the nursery, she heard a sound that she had never been so happy to hear in her entire life. Leo began to cry. She ran to him, clutching him to her chest as he wailed with a vigor that proved he was finally awake. Outside, she heard the neighbor's dog bark, and a few minutes later, she saw Mrs. Gable stumble onto her porch, looking confused and dazed. The spell had been broken, but Sarah knew they couldn't stay. She packed a single bag, threw it into her car, and drove out of that town without looking back, leaving the shattered remains of the tape on the kitchen floor. Years later, Sarah would find out that the house she had rented was formerly owned by one of the lead researchers of that university project. He had apparently taken his work home with him, hiding the final master tape in the nursery cabinet before he disappeared. The frequency wasn't meant for babies. It was designed to be a broadcast that could silence an entire city. To this day, Sarah cannot listen to soft music or humming without feeling a cold shiver. She often thinks about what would have happened if she hadn't smashed that tape. She imagines a world of silence where an entire neighborhood is frozen in time, their eyes open but their minds gone, waiting for a song that never ends. It is a haunting image that stays with her every time she tries to fall asleep in the dark, because she knows that even though she destroyed one tape, the frequency itself is still out there, hidden in the static of the world. The sleep spell was a nightmare hidden in a melody, a reminder that peace is sometimes just a mask for something much more permanent. But while Sarah was fighting to wake up her world in Ohio, a group of travelers in the high deserts of Nevada was about to find out that some objects don't just carry sounds, they carry memories. And sometimes those memories are so powerful that they can physicalize themselves in the heat of the noon sun.